So to conclude our presentation, where are my notes here? Neal McCluskey, Ph.D. He is the Associate Director of Cato's Center for Educational Freedom. He served in the U.S. Army. Thank you. He also taught high school English. He wrote the book, Feds in the Classroom, How Big Government Corrupts, Cripples, and Compromises American Education. And he's going to tell us about essentially the federal takeover of our entire education system. So let's welcome Neal McCluskey.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Yvonne and Glenn for putting this together and for inviting me to come visit with you. It's very hard to follow both warrior moms and warrior FERPA experts. So I don't know if there's such a thing as a warrior wonk. It's probably not me. I kind of just cower in my office all day. So I'm going to do as best I can. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you as quick as I can, overview of American education, just so you get a sense for where Common Core is in the overall trajectory of education governance. Unfortunately, Jamie stole a little of this, so he didn't tell me he was going to undercut my talk. So I'll go through it even faster. Then I want to talk, you've heard, no doubt, that Common Core is state-led and voluntary. Well, I think you know by now, although I'm going to give you the facts again, as to why this is not the case. It has not been state-led, it has not been voluntary. More important, though, is going forward, according to the logic of the pro-Common Core people, it cannot be state-led and it cannot be voluntary. So you may think, well, New York can get involved in this and we can pull out at any time. The fact of the matter is, once states say they're in Common Core, there's not going to be a chance to get out of it. Now is the time to do it. So just a little bit of that, I almost forgot. I'm also going to talk a little bit about data collection, although you've already heard that this is about ultimately preparing a workforce. I'm going to give you a little bit more specificity on that, where we know very clearly that the goal is to prepare a workforce. So the first thing I think you should know, I always like to give some education history, is that from basically the first arrival at Plymouth Rock to the 1830s, education was something that was really based in families, and based in religious communities, and based in local communities. This wasn't something that most people thought government, really any type, should have much to do with. Certainly they didn't think government should be dictating what you learn. So even community public schools, this was really bottom up. Things that communities ran for themselves, not that was dictated from above. You now have to go to about 1830. We'll go to late 1830. Now, Jamie's from Massachusetts, so I blame him a little for this. So he talked about where Massachusetts is, but they really need to make up for a lot of bad things they've done. But not everyone's going to agree with me on this. But anybody know what I'm talking about in the 1830s? What really changed this? A lot of people like this, so it's going to be controversial. This Horace Mann, right, and the Common Schools movement. This is really the beginning of state authorities saying that we should have a uniform system of schools. And the idea behind common schools was to impose a certain uniformity. It wasn't really about workforce development, and that's good. But it was about saying, look, there are certain values that everybody might not share that we think should be inculcated in all children. And that's a concerning thing if you think, well, again, education used to be from the bottom up. Communities deciding for themselves how they would educate their children. Parents deciding for themselves how they educate their children. And now you get the idea that no, there has to be this uniformity and it should be imposed to some extent from above. That doesn't mean that Horace Mann was saying, well, we'll have the state dictate everything, because this was a very new revolutionary idea. Again, most Americans didn't think it was the purview of government to control schools and to control education. But he did say we do need to establish these common schools, schools where they would basically teach the same things to all students. Now, part of this was driven by the beginning of industrialization, especially in New England. And so you start to see people coming in from the countryside who are a little different from the people who live in the cities, and that was concerning. And then a little after that, a little later in the beginning of the Common Schools movement, you had a big influx of Irish immigrants. And what we'll see throughout the history, unfortunately, of public schooling is the idea that these schools, to some extent, should be assimilating people, making them all the same. And so we do have at least the beginning of this idea that the schools are to engineer things. But again, very important to understand, still, for the most part, they remain something that was bottom-up, responsive to the community. I should also point out that in this time, 1620 to 1830, we did have 1789 with the enactment of the Constitution, and the Constitution gives the federal government no authority whatsoever to be involved in education. This is absolutely critical. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives the federal government its specific enumerated powers. It has no powers outside of those, and there is nothing about education in that document. And don't think that the General Welfare Clause changes this. The General Welfare Clause simply introduces the reason for giving the federal government the powers that it has. Those specific enumerated powers are supposed to promote the general welfare. And so what the federal government is doing now is certainly in violation of clear writing in the 3 laws that you've already heard talked about. But even more importantly, it's a violation of the Constitution because nobody at the time of the writing of the Constitution, or almost nobody, would have thought the federal government should have any authority over how your children are educated. So, starting with the Common Schools movement, really we're going to go to about the 1950s. The main centralization you see is there is a lot of consolidation of small neighborhood districts, small districts that serve in particular specific ethnic communities and things like that, into bigger districts. Often driven by kind of elites and cities, the elite power structure. But we still had basically local public schools all the way into the 1950s, very little federal involvement. And then something happens in 1957 that begins to change pretty quickly what the federal government's role is. Anybody know 1957? Very scary. Yeah, Sputnik. So the Russians send up this satellite, it beeps a lot, it's pointy, and it's kind of scary. And we think that, well, we have fallen behind in the space race. And so people say, this is a fault of the education system. And actually, President Eisenhower was well aware that we were not behind the Soviet Union in the space race. But there was a lot of concern, and certainly legitimate concern, about, given that we were in the Cold War. But he says, okay, the federal government is now going to get behind something called the National Defense Education Act. This is really the first time the federal government starts to say it has a role in shaping what people are learning. It's more aimed at higher education than K through 12. It's about we need more science, technology, engineering, mathematics, the STEM fields, which I'm sure you've heard about, because that's what everything is about, more STEM. Well, that was a big part of this, also foreign languages and things like that. What's important, though, is even though this is unprecedented, the federal government kind of saying we need to take charge of education, shape it the way we need it. It was still specifically connected to defense, which was the legitimate federal power. When does this change or changes? In 1965 with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which you've heard a little bit already. Now let's note 1965 is about 350 years after the landing at Plymouth Rock. So we've gone 3.5 centuries without any sort of federal involvement outside of something connected to the National Defense Education. Yeah, and somehow, I almost forgot to say, it's estimated that by 1840, so really when education was still something that was based in families and communities, we probably had the highest literacy rate of any country in the world. People were educating their children because people care about their children. They don't need someone to tell them to do that. And so it's clear evidence that we don't need somebody telling us to give our children what we know they need. So anyway, 350 years later, we get the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And the main purpose of this wasn't to control education. It was to provide compensatory funding for low-income districts. So people who were poor communities were supposed to get extra funding. Now, there are constitutional questions with this, no doubt. But the idea was not to control what is taught or control how things are taught. It was to say we're going to help districts that don't have as much money. There is a problem with this, though, as we all now know. Whatever the federal government pays for, it ultimately controls. Some of that is good intentions, because what we found after ESEA was the money wasn't really translating into any better outcomes. So to the extent we say, well, we want to make sure the taxpayer gets their value, that makes some sense. But the idea that the federal government, that people in Washington should be controlling what your local schools are teaching, it doesn't even make sense. How does anybody in Washington know what you need here in New York very well? Even your representatives spend most of their time, or much of their time, in Washington. In any event, now we can see they start spending money, but then the control starts to creep up. 1979, you have the creation of the Department of Education. The Department of Education becomes basically one-stop shopping lobbying for people who want to use the federal government in large extent, one, to get money for themselves. Let's not mistake this. A lot of people are saying, we want money and we want control. In particular, they want money. And so this now gives them that mechanism to really grab the reins of education. This is a cabinet level position. This is above almost anything else the federal government does. 1983, Jamie already mentioned it, you have a nation at risk. A nation at risk famously said if a foreign nation were to do to us what we've done to ourselves, our education system, we'd considered it an act of war. And believe me, I don't think our education system was doing a very good job. The problem is, again, centralizing in Washington is certainly not going to make it better. But what this report did is, it now moves sort of moral authority to Washington. People started to look to the Secretary of Education to say, ooh, tell us what's wrong with our system. Tell us how we can fix it. They kept this wall chart up of SAT scores and other things. And they said, look, we can tell you how bad your state is, how good your state is. And so it moved people's attention to say, look, Washington is where we go for answers. 1988, you have the next reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And for the first time, the federal government says, if you are getting Title I money, you need to show us that students are making some sort of progress. It's the beginning of the federal government saying, we're not just going to give you money anymore. We want you to report to us on outcomes. 1989, don't think that, I should say, that the nationalization, the federalization of your standards just started in 2009. So what happened is 1989, for the first time, the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, says, I'm going to convene all the nation's governors in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we're going to talk about setting national education goals. So, yeah, it's the same sort of state-led thing as Common Core. You were summoned to do as the federal government says, and feel free to do it if you like. If not, well, we'll see what the ramifications are. 1991, so they have their summit. He has put together a group that's going to put together something called America 2000 to move toward these national goals. Now, this was never enacted into law, but then Secretary of Education Lamar Alexander, currently Senator Lamar Alexander, says, well, one of the things in America 2000 was we're going to have voluntary national standards. And then we'll have voluntary national tests. Well, he didn't get it enacted into law, so what did he do? He said, I have discretionary funding right here at the Department of Education. I'll commission these things. I'll commission the creation of national standards in several subjects. 1994, a very important year. George H.W. Bush is no longer president. Bill Clinton is president. He was very much involved in the national standards movement when he was the governor of Arkansas. And he essentially rebrands America 2000 as Goals 2000. And the important thing about Goals 2000 is it adds a couple of national goals, but it creates something called the National Education Standards and Improvement Council, something called NESIC. And the idea of NESIC was it was going to look at every state's standards and tests and give the federal stamp of approval on them. And it was supposed to be, again, voluntary. They said very clearly this is voluntary, but it was never intended to be voluntary. In 1994, something else happened. Well, several things happened, but the next thing was the Improving America's School Act, which is really just the next reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And it started to say, states, if you want your annual appropriation of Title I money, what you get every year, the biggest chunk of federal money there is, you actually have to have now state standards. You have to have state tests, and the federal government will approve these things. So basically, at least where we No Child Left Behind. Except one thing happened. 1994, something else very important politically, Republicans are swept into office. A A lot of people are very unhappy with what they saw as federal overreach, and the Republicans killed NESIC, which was going to be the mechanism by which the federal government said, your standards are good, you get money, or your standards are bad, you don't get money. So we are saved from where we are now for a little while. Then we get 2002. What law was passed then? No Child Left Behind. So No Child Left Behind has now moved us, well, let me backtrack. Because the Improving American School Act did do things like No Child Left Behind. It did require testing in bands of grades. And it said that you have to make adequate yearly progress. So it does begin to set, now for the first time, the federal government sets a framework around how every state school system works. But No Child Left Behind really enforces this, because after 1994 there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm to enforce the Improving American School Act. Most states didn't follow it. But now you have the next President Bush, he said, I'm going to really make sure this thing is followed. And I'm going to make sure that you test kids in 3 through 8 and once in high school. And you have to have adequate yearly progress for cohorts of students. So it's not really about individual students, which might have made some sense. It's about, did this year's third grader do better than last year's third grader? And it says you have to disaggregate the data for different groups. And finally, it says all students will be something called proficient by 2014. So this is a much more, and there's a whole bunch of punishments that follow if you don't make adequate yearly progress at school. And so now the federal government has very clearly said, we're going to dictate to every state, and therefore to every school district, exactly how your system is going to be structured. And the reason is that they said, look, we spent a lot of money and we haven't gotten results for it. And that was true. The fact of the matter is we can look and we can see, actually from the early 1970s to today, with huge federal involvement, they still haven't gotten any results because the federal government is incapable of running education.
It's true.
You laugh, but there are people in Washington who think very much the opposite. I laugh at them too, it doesn't do any good. So, 2002, No Child Left Behind. Now we get to 2009. What had happened in No Child Left Behind is that states set standards, as they were called. They had state tests, and they had proficiency definitions, but they set them very low. And of course, this is what you'd expect, because human beings are all basically the same. And it is much easier to have a low bar, especially when the federal government's yelling at you and threatening to withhold your money, that it's easy to get people over, than actually set a high bar and do hard work to get them over. And especially when the timelines are extremely unrealistic. And so, not surprisingly, most states did not set really high bars to get over. And then each state was a little different. And this was intentional. So we get to 2009. Now, everybody hates No Child Left Behind. Well, most people do. But nobody agrees on what to do with it. So the law was supposed to be reauthorized in 2007. Nobody could agree. And so rather than follow the democratic process, the president said, and took advantage of a crisis, which of course talked about with the recession, and supporters of national standards this is. Because I used to go to a lot of national standards groups, meetings, and conferences, and they didn't think they were going to get national standards in most states for a very long time. But then the recession happened, the stimulus happens, and an opportunity happens to say, okay, this will be easy. We'll just have the president decide, well, we're going to take this race to the top, and we're going to say you have to adopt national standards if you want this money. By the way, it's all state-led and voluntary. And the funny thing about that is, it's no more state-led and voluntary than No Child Left Behind. No state has to follow No Child Left Behind. You as taxpayers must pay your taxes to the federal government. You go to jail. But states are free to say, please don't send back the money that came from our people because we don't want to follow your rules. In any event, see, I'm going too long with this whole history. But for the first time now, using the stimulus, the federal government has gone beyond setting the framework of your education system to setting what you will teach to your children. And they say, this is just standards. Well, okay, first of all, standards are not divorced from curriculum in any way. They set a box around what your curriculum can be. More importantly, the federal government established those tests. They paid for those tests. They picked the consortium that make the tests. And what gets tested is what gets taught. And of course, as we've heard, nobody's ever actually seen what's on those tests. You got to take them, but you don't get to see what they are. And so even if we'll agree that the standards are not curriculum, when those tests come, they will dictate curriculum. If you see that students are tested on reading EPA regulations every year. Even if you don't see the test, the word gets out, kids say what they've seen, then you're going to be teaching in your schools EPA regulations every year. So that's where we get, and part of the stimulus was state fiscal stabilization fund, race to the top, and it all has national standards and data collection in it. I'm going to talk about data collection. In 2011, just to sort of cement it, you had No Child Left Behind waivers. So most states had said they're going to adopt Common Core because they want to get race to the top money. Of course, not every state won race to the top. So they said, oh, by the way, if you want to get released from this crazy law that's so punitive and illogical, you have to sign on to national standards, among other things. Now, they did say that you could have your largest state college university system certify your standards as college and career ready, but most states had already promised to use Common Core with the race to the top application. So by far the easiest thing to do was say, okay, we're going to use race to the top. So the trajectory is very clear. For a very long time, schools were controlled by communities, the people they're supposed to serve. Only very recently, the last 50 years, out of about a 400-year history, has the federal government been involved. And it's maybe only in the last 20 years that it has dictated more and more about what is actually taught. And again, what I need to emphasize here is, first of all, that the feds are on the verge of complete control. This is almost the last line, just short of them saying, we're not even going to go with the pretense of selecting the tests. We're just going to tell you what your curriculum is. And be very careful. I think that a lot of states and a lot of people think, well, our state will sign on to Common Core, but we won't really follow it. We'll do it to get the money. If you go 5 years from now, and they reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and most states are saying they're on the Common Core, most people won't remember this fight 5 years from now. And the federal government will say, look, everybody's already using the same standards, of course. We'll just test everybody on the same standard, the same test. We'll tell you what your curriculum should be, because you're all basically using the same thing anyway. And we will connect your Title I money, those big annual appropriations, to how you do on the federal test and the federal curriculum. So we have to remember kind of the slippery slope problem. If you accept it today, people are not going to remember 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and 10 years down the line that all states didn't always have the same standards. So why do I say the Common Core? Obviously we know it was never state-led. In fact, 2008, before there was something called the Common Core officially, the National Government Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, put out a report called Benchmarking for Success. Anybody read it?
Yes.
Yeah, some people have, most people have it, and of course you wouldn't have heard of it. What they were, in this report, they were saying, we really need to go to every state on common internationally benchmarked standards. They didn't call it Common Core, they didn't have the name at the time. But it said something very interesting. It's varied, but they said, what's the job of the federal government? And they said the job of the federal government is to incentivize adoption of national standards, internationally benchmarked common standards. And they say the way they do it is one, offering money, and two, offering regulatory relief. Exactly the things that happen with Race to the Top and NCLB waivers. And one thing that drives me nuts is, because I spent a lot of time talking to Common Core people, so naturally I'm driven a little nuts. But what they say is, we didn't want this. The Obama administration got the federal government involved, and we didn't want it. Well, that's absolutely not true, and you can look at this report, and you have the evidence of it, and you can look at, well, you can't anymore. You used to be able to look at the Common Core State Standards Initiative website, and on their FAQ section, it repeated, the job of the federal government is to incentivize states to adopt these things. You look now, and what it says is, the federal government never had anything to do with requiring anybody to use this. So I wish I could say you can check my sources on that, but you can check Benchmarking for Success, and you can see very clearly where they call for that. And the reason they call for it is one of the main pieces of logic driving Common Core is the idea that states cannot be trusted to run their own education system. Now, I have a lot of problems with centralized control of schooling, and that applies to states. It also often applies to districts. I don't think that means go to Common Core, but these people do. If that's your assumption, and if you think the solution to education is you have to have some sort of centralized standard, who or what is the only entity that can make states do things? It's the federal government. Of course they need the federal government involved in this. If you believe that states won't reform themselves, then you have to say, look, we got to call on the higher power to do it. And so don't think that this is just going to be something that you can make go away. In fact, Checker Finn from the Fordham Institute, anybody hear about them? Yeah, big supporters of Common Core, but they talk about a tripod. You have to have a tripod in place for accountability work. Common standards, common tests, and common punishments based on how you do on those tests. And so that makes sense, because they're saying, look, states, if they have common standards but not common tests, they just weasel out the test. They don't have common punishments, they have no reason to follow the test. You can see where this is going. So again, their rationale requires that this be federal. Why won't that work? Well, first of all, and I should say, why won't they just admit that? Why not just say, we think this should be federal? For one thing, nobody wants the federal government in charge. There was just a poll of parents that asked, well, do you want the federal government saying what subjects you have to have a standardized testing? Not even asking what should be in the test or anything like that. Only 20% of parents said the federal government should have any say in what is tested, much less what the tests are or the standards are. Clearly, people cherish local control and don't really cherish the federal government all that much. There is a problem of, you see in government that special interests have a lot of power. It's basic motivation. So just as I would like to get paid $1 million and not have anyone tell me what to do, there are a lot of people who work in education who say, look, please don't make me do anything. There are lots of good reasons for that. The idea that the federal government should dictate what is taught and how it's taught is ridiculous. But there are also people who say, please just keep sending the money, and that's a problem. But that's going to keep happening at the federal level, just as it happens at state and local level. In fact, it's even worse at the federal level because you have kind of one-stop shopping. You're like, well, I don't have to worry about states and districts anymore to try and control them. Just go to Washington. I'll take care of that today. And also, politicians are soundbite driven. They will say things that sound good in a 20-second soundbite, like we all need high standards, so support Common Core. That is how politics works. That's why you want to get education as far away from politics and as close to local control as you can get it. Also, if you're unhappy with your schools now, at least you can move to a different state.
That's right.
If the federal government takes over, I guess we go to Canada. Which, by the way, has no federal Department of Education.
And no
so
standards.
I'm just saying something to think about. Finally, it kills laboratories of democracy. The fact of the matter is, not only are all kids different, and therefore we need different types of education for different kids. And to me, that means school choice. But at the very least, it means local control. So that's a big problem. But laboratories of democracy, at the very least, states can try different things. Concede, maybe the Common Core is great standards. But because we're not omniscient, we don't know there could be something even better. The way you find out what's better is you let different standards compete. Well, that's what laboratories of democracy does. States can try different things that may be really good, but if they're bad, they don't drag everyone down with them. The federal government takes over, those laboratories are gone. You are stuck with one monopoly standard that doesn't ever improve. Finally, just a little bit about data collection. Data collection is integral to federal accountability, and social scientists are partially responsible for our problem, at least in my estimation. So, first of all, of course, we need, if you think you need to engineer education from the federal level, you've got to have data on which to do that. But this goes far beyond K through 12, and it really is about birth to workforce control. And you can see it if you follow higher ed. I follow higher ed as well as K through 12. And the big thing in higher ed right now is to say, look, the federal government needs to collect data and needs to publish data, and it needs to rank every college according to this data so that you can know whether or not you're going to a good school or a bad school. And the president just talked about this 3 weeks ago. He said by 2015, the federal government will collect data and rate schools. Then 2018, it will connect student aid, federal aid, to those schools. So you won't be able to take your student aid to some schools that the federal government deems good or bad. And one of the data points he says these ratings will be based on is salaries of graduates. There is your workforce connection. So you hear this term P through 20W, pre-K all the way through grade to 20, whatever that is, and then into the workforce, W. And that is absolutely intentional. And I don't think it's necessarily badly intended. For some people it is. But some people think that, look, what we need to do is be able to assess whether or not a school is good. If you really want to know whether a school is good, you need to control for everything that went into a child outside of school. Both, starting at birth and then from whatever goes on outside. The reason for this, and I'm not saying it works, just work through the logic here of the social sciences, is that, look, the school may be good at teaching English, but might not get good test scores somewhere else. And it's because maybe the kids don't have adequate nutrition, or maybe, as the National Education Data Model asks for, their bus schedules are bad, or maybe their religion has a negative impact on their schools, also in the National Education Data Model. And so the social scientist says, if we want to know what a good school is, we've got to control everything that goes on outside that school. And this is exactly what the federal government's been talking about for a long time. We will assess the quality of a school, and that means we have to control for the quality of the students. That's why they're doing all this data collection. And then if the goal is ultimately to assess colleges, then they say, look, I need to know everything about every school anyone went to before they went to college. So I can say, well, the college isn't responsible for the bad things that high school did or the bad things that middle school did. Now you see where all the data collection is linked. And ultimately they judge the colleges based on how much money you make, but all that is already, we have to control for everything outside of the schools so we can judge the schools. It gets even more insidious beyond the schools, where they say, and now we can use this sort of data to engineer the children. Now people will say that this is tinfoil hat stuff. It's not. This is how social scientists think, and sometimes that data can be useful. It would be good to know, should your children eat more broccoli? Because as a parent, I'm like, oh, broccoli helps you learn better. We'll eat more broccoli. Where it's dangerous is when you let politicians control that data and then apply it to whatever they decide they want to do with it. Yep. And that is the direction in which we're going. And you can see, you guys have heard about the skin sensors?
Yep.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And people, oh, okay, well, so there was a report, a federally commissioned report, that's all about grit. This is the new thing in education, is that, well, maybe kids in America just don't try hard enough. When the going gets tough, they get going to the playing field or something like that. And so they said, we need to work on grit. How do we get kids to work through stuff? And what this report said, it's a big report, and the sensors aren't the biggest part of it. But they said, there is now this technology where we can track kids' eyeballs and their skin reactions when they're doing tests. And again, I actually don't think the intention's bad. It's very scary. But the idea is we're going to help kids get grit. But you can see where all this is going. The federal government then says, again, well-intentioned, well, now we just have to, now that we have all this data on your kids, we can then have interventions, which the government likes to talk about, where we'll do things to make them more gritty. And so that people will say that this is tinfoil hat, this is pie in the sky. And we do have a problem when we talk about Common Core, in that this doesn't come directly from the Common Core. The Common Core is part of a much bigger federal effort. Common Core is, when I said controlling for variables, that's how you control for the test variable. We all know that we're evaluating everybody on the same thing, so we don't have to try and control for, well, this test did this, and these students did that. But it's part of something much bigger that the federal government is doing. So the point here is that Common Core does not exist in isolation, and it's not intended to. It is supposed to be federal because it's part of an overall, long-standing effort to control education and ultimately to control the workforce from above. That, I think,